Thanks, Mark. Good evening to all of you. I am absolutely thrilled to be here at Green College, which, as Mark mentioned, I am journalist in residence for this term during my stay as Asper professor at the journalism school. And today I'm going to give you a bit of a tour of my experiences going back almost 10 years now of ways I and others have used social media to explore and understand the revolutions that have happened in the Middle East and elsewhere. And so, like all serious talks about journalism, it needs to begin in a rather solemn place. In my case, it begins with Big Bird. So I went to college at Northwestern University in Chicago. And to prepare myself for the job market, I majored in rhetoric and religion. And it became pretty clear that that was not solid reasoning on my part. So in my free time, I founded a music magazine with some friends and then decided to stick around to get a master's degree in telecommunications science and policy. And when I graduated, most people end up going to the Federal Communications Commission and other places like that, doing internet policy work and telecom policy. And again, I started asking myself what I had gotten myself into. And so when I received a postgraduate fellowship to go to Washington, D.C. and work at one of these institutions, I begged them off and said, please don't send me to the FTC. Can I go work with Big Bird? Because I'd always been interested in education, children's television, and it just sounded a hell of a lot more fun than working with policy wonks. So ultimately, I ended at a place called the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is a nonprofit in the U.S. that manages federal funding from the government that goes to NPR and PBS stations. So it's almost the equivalent of a bureaucratic entity overseeing the CBC, but American style. And they didn't know what to do with me because they knew I was interested in Big Bird, and honestly, they wanted me to work on other things. But they did give me time to experiment a bit and write about things that I thought were interesting. And at that time, I was really, really interested in how schools were going to have to change as internet access was becoming ubiquitous. At this point in time, only around 4% of American schools had internet access. And so I started writing a series of essays on what I thought might happen. I taught myself HTML, which is the coding language of the web, and put it on a server at the organization, and for lack of a better name, called it EdWeb, Exploring Technology and School Reform. As you can see, this thing is almost 25 years old now. My God. Yeah. I have websites older than some of your students. Yeah, it's strange, but that is true now. So I created this site that went into a lot of detail about aspects of telecommunications policy and education policy. And when it was released, I started getting messages from lots of really smart and interesting and occasionally powerful people asking me the deepest, toughest questions about the state of education at that point today. I had no answers for them because I was a glorified intern. I found a topic I was interested in. I took the initiative to publish something. And because people weren't doing much of that back in 1994, people thought, well, I must be an expert of some sort. And so in order to get out of these awkward conversations where I really didn't know what I was talking about, I decided to set up an email listserv called www.edu, or WeDo. And this was launched in late 1994, early 1995. And I invited all of these people, and I said, for all of you who have questions about education technology and the state of telecommunications, this is the place to come and discuss it with each other. So I could kind of recede into the background and listen and learn and not be too terribly stressed out about it. And as I watched this community grow over the next few years, I realized that the email list was actually more of an exciting accomplishment on my part than the website ever was. Because, I mean, it was a website that had articles that were broken up into little pages and had some really bad graphics on them. You know, it was fine for 1994. But this email list was becoming an actual community. People checked in with each other when they were grading each other's papers. When there was an earthquake near someone's school district, people would want to make sure they were okay and reach out and possibly donate to the Red Cross. These were people who had never met each other but clearly had so many shared interests and shared values that they were looking out for each other. And that was profound to me. And I didn't realize it at the time, but what I witnessed in that group back in late 94, early 95 would affect the rest of my career up until today. So after spending about 5 years at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, I was given the opportunity in 1999 to become a part of what ended up being one of the very first nonprofit social networks on the internet. It was called the Digital Divide Network, and it was based in Washington, D.C. What we ended up doing was creating an online space for over 10,000 practitioners in 140 countries that were working on education technology, bringing internet access into communities, human rights, policymakers who weren't sure what to do next. And we created this space almost like a Facebook, but focused on policy issues, in which they could share their best thinking with each other. And it was crazy that I got to be paid to do this. In many ways, it was exactly where I thought I should be going after having done the work that I'd done in education technology before this. And then 9/11 happened. On September 11th, 2001, I was working in my office in Washington, D.C. at the corner of 18th and K Northwest, about a 5-10 minute walk from the White House, and I saw a note on the Yahoo homepage saying a small plane had just crashed into one of the towers. And I didn't pay too much attention to it immediately, but then my colleagues started murmuring over the next 20 to 30 minutes as we saw the internet started to slow down and stop. Our cell phones weren't working anymore. We weren't able to talk to anyone. And then finally someone did manage to get an email to come through where one of their relatives mentioned to them that 2 planes had crashed into the towers, and it was actually terrorism. Well, we were sorting out what to do next and trying to find if there was any radio in the office, and here we were at a telecom policy foundation, not a single radio in the office. The word of the Pentagon attack came in. We decided the best thing to do was to leave. And so we decided to set up a buddy system, so for everyone who didn't live within walking distance of downtown would go with someone else. And so I lived in walking distance in an area called DuPont Circle, 20-minute walk just north of there. And so a colleague and I went out into the streets and saw the thousands and thousands of other people doing the same thing. Everyone's quietly walking northwards, leaving the city. Every time you would hear a car backfire or a helicopter go overhead, everyone would flinch and then get back to walking quietly and slowly. And so I get to my house, finally have access to a TV, and I'm watching what's going on. And like probably anyone else who was watching at the time, I felt pretty helpless. I just had no idea what was going to happen next. And I said to my wife, I wish I could do something about this. And she looked at me like I was nuts, like it was so obvious, how could I not figure it out? And she said, why haven't you created a community already to talk about this online? And so I dropped whatever I was doing, I ran to my laptop, and quickly set up a page on Yahoo groups that became known as September 11 Info. The very first person to post on this was my brother, who was standing on his rooftop at the corner of 12th and 2nd Ave in New York, watching the towers coming down, and was getting ready to leave to head back to his office at the AP to start cataloging lists of the dead, knowing he had dozens of friends working there at the Twin Towers at that point. And as word spread around about this email list, it grew and grew and grew in a matter of hours, to the point where people were emailing at it at least once a minute. So thousands of messages over the first few days. It was the equivalent of Twitter before Twitter existed. People posting things such as, I hear that there's been an attack on the National Mall in the State Department. Has the State Department been bombed? Then I could go outside and look on my balcony straight down towards the State Department 10 blocks away, not see any smoke. Apparently CNN and ABC had gotten it wrong. Could see smoke in the distance over the Pentagon, but nothing at the State Department. And on this went, with people chiming in for weeks on end trying to sort out fact from fiction, because no one knew what was going on, not only just in the aftermath, but in the weeks and months that followed. And so as that settled down, I really wanted to start experimenting with ways of creating spaces online where anyone could easily contribute. make it super easy where if you knew nothing about the internet, you could still have an impact. So I thought, okay, this has been 9/11, very intense, very somber. Let's find something a bit lighter. Well, it turns out that the artists Christo and Jean-Claude were about to go to New York to set up this incredible installation in Central Park called The Gates. And so I set up a blog using free tools available at the time and called it The Gates is Central Park. And I rigged together a few simple tools so that if you sent an email to a particular address, it would automatically post it as a blog entry there. Meanwhile, if you didn't have internet access, there was a phone number. You could call that, and it would post it not only on the website, but it would become a part of a podcast automatically. And so all of these people who went to go see The Gates in the 2 weeks it was open in Central Park would chime in and record their thoughts, how much they loved it, how much they hated it. And it was just a wonderful, beautiful exercise in sort of the mob discussion art. And then a few months later, Katrina happened. I found myself getting into this pattern where every time I tried to do something that was a bit more relaxing, something serious would happen. In this particular case, I figured that what I was doing before here at the Gates applied just as much to people who were trying to get out of Katrina's way. And so I didn't even bother changing the orange graphic at the top. I just changed the damn name, added some new text, added a few more features so people could tag photos on Flickr and upload things in other ways. And for the next several months, people used it to share their stories of what happened to them during Katrina and how they, as first responders and volunteers, were working to help them. Some of them even spontaneously organized a group to collect missing persons data that had been posted on websites and news organizations, just people posting in comment sections, I can't find my cousin, I can't find my brother. Years later, that tool would eventually be adopted by Google as the official Google People Finder project. It all began because of volunteers coming together during Katrina. And I really began asking myself what I wanted to do next with my life. Here I was working still in telecommunications policy, but I was beginning to feel more like an online community organizer, which, as far as I knew at the time, wasn't a job that anyone had, but that seemed like what I was doing. Well, I was lucky, because there was one person at NPR who was thinking the same thing. Her name was Maria Thomas, and at the time she was vice president of digital at NPR. And she reached out to me in late 2005 and asked if I had ever thought of going into public radio. And I said, not really. I don't really care for NPR. Can I say that out loud? I kind of a little dull. And she's like, well, that's part of the problem. We need to find ways of reaching out to new audiences and engaging people in different ways. And so if I could find a way to bring you here, would you come? Well, the conversation continued for about 6 months, and eventually she was able to bring me in to NPR on September 11th, 2006, the 5th anniversary of 9/11, with my job title being Senior Product Manager for Communities. It was a funny title. It was nice that I was senior, whatever that meant. It was probably a bit of a pay bump. I wasn't managing any products, and they didn't have a community at the time, apart from like people donating to local stations, but certainly not online. They certainly didn't consider me a journalist. I mean, they made sure to tell me that they thought I wasn't a journalist, and I was fine with that. I just wanted to stay out of people's way and tinker with stuff. And so over the next few years, that's what I did. I tinkered. And probably the one space that gave me the most room to flex my muscles and see what I could do in terms of online community organizing and journalism was Twitter, which had launched at some point in the middle of 2006, I believe, originally as a group text messaging system, but then it had started expanding to be used as a web-based messaging system that people could send in other ways on their phones as well. And so by February 17th, 2007, I figured, what the hell, I'll give it a shot. And having nothing else to say, I described what was happening in front of me, which was my daughter playing with a toy or inside a toy while my wife was preparing some appetizers before dinner. And my tweets didn't get any better after that. And honestly, it really didn't for most other people either, because for the first few years of Twitter, the joke was, what are you having for lunch? Because that's all people talked about. It was really mundane stuff. You weren't seeing people doing much beyond that. But I also saw a lot of people who were clearly news junkies and interested in all sorts of different topics, from politics to international relations to music. And I wanted to see if there were ways that we could engage them. And so I set up an NPR Twitter account. I didn't tell them I was setting up an NPR Twitter account, but once they found out, it was getting good reviews, so that was good. And over the next couple of years, they actually let me play with a few projects that they actually promoted. So for example, during the 2008 presidential election, we used the hashtag #FactCheck to fact-check the presidential debates. And we had hundreds of people volunteering from all over the place, watching the candidates argue with each other, making all sorts of different claims, and writing back to us using the hashtag, saying, oh, that candidate meant to say this, and here's a primary source proving otherwise. And so the group of journalists who had been assigned to fact-check the debate, as NPR always had a group of journalists doing that, suddenly had the equivalent of hundreds of researchers and research assistants who were helping them do their work, and allowed us to cover so much more ground than we would have in any other way. Later that year, we took it a step further when a group of volunteers approached me and a few others and said, what can we do to monitor voting problems? I said, well, I don't know. I mean, we can use the same tools we've been using, but I don't know how we'd sort through it all. And so these people started asking around their own networks through Twitter, through email, whatever it happened to be. And several people volunteered to actually write some scripts for us and create an app. And so on election day, people could either use this app or use Twitter to tag it with their postal code and a description of what they just experienced while voting. All of this got sucked into a database which even more volunteers were looking at round the clock in case we saw any stories percolating up. And because we were concerned about the digital divide, which was absolutely real at that time, we made sure that there was a text messaging version of it too. So if you didn't have an iPhone where you could install an app, or if you didn't have Twitter on the web, you could at least send a text message to this address, include your zip code in the description, and then we would be able to tabulate it. And so once again, it became another way for NPR to show that there were ways that people could give to NPR beyond the typical aspect of donating money or maybe volunteering at your local station. You could volunteer your skills, you could volunteer your time, you could share your knowledge, you could tap into your social network, and by that I don't mean Facebook, but just the people you know, in order to figure out what skills we can all bring to the table and work on a shared goal together. And so once again, I was getting paid to do something that I thought was a lot of fun. And this went on for a few years until in late 2010, I started seeing tweets with a hashtag called #CityBouzid. Now the name rang a bell because when I was working on digital divide issues 5-6 years before that, I'd had the chance to travel to Tunisia on several occasions for some UN-related events. I got to meet some local bloggers, I got to meet the local police and get detained for hanging out with those bloggers. You know, it was sort of a typical North African tourism experience. But #CityBouzid, I knew it wasn't the name of another town I had been to, but it was similar enough that it seemed very Tunisian to me. So I started reading back through the threads from a few days before and saw that some of these very bloggers that I'd met a few years beforehand were tweeting about an incident in which a young man named Mohammed Bouazizi, he had a fruit cart and he sold fruit on the streets of this small middle-of-nowhere town, #CityBouzid. And one day, several government officials demanded a bribe from him. He didn't have any money. He just got the fruit cart. He was paying it off. The only money he had left would be to buy more fruit, and he refused. So they turned over his fruit cart, ruined his food. One of them slapped him across the face and confiscated the fruit cart. None of this had to happen. They were just exercising their power against this poor young man because they could. A little while later, he returned to the scene with a can of either gasoline or paint thinner. And he stood in front of the local government office and yelled out something to them to the effect of, I can't keep living like this. He poured it on himself and he set himself on fire. Now, people quickly came and put the fire out, but he was gravely injured. In fact, he would pass away 4 weeks later. But locals were furious, and so some of them began yelling at government officials. They started chanting the young man's name, and some of them took pictures of it and shared it with their friends through various social networks. The next morning, thousands of people from the surrounding community marched across downtown in front of the main government building, demanding that there be justice for this young man, Mohammed Bouazizi. More people were there with more cameras, and they filmed what was going on and uploaded it to Twitter and Facebook and Dailymotion and dating websites and wherever it would take to spread the word, and tagged it with the phrase Sidi Bouzid, because that was the name of the town where it all began. Now, the holiday season was just beginning. This was, he set himself on fire around December 18th, and so a week later, I've been trying to keep up with what was going on in Tunisia while doing things with my family, and honestly didn't know how to process it, and so I tweeted to my followers, following protests in Tunisia via Sidi Bouzid hashtag, wonder what the chances of all this leading to a Jasmine revolution? Don't know. I didn't know what else to call it, but I figured we needed to be able to call it something, and every time I had been to Tunisia, you would see children and young men walking around with jasmine flowers in their hair, and thinking of the Velvet Revolution and Green Revolution and others, for lack of a better name, I just referred to it as that. And day after day, I saw more people talking about it online, and day after day, apart from a few organizations like Reuters and Al Jazeera, I didn't see many news organizations describing these expanding protests across the country. So I took it upon myself to just start tweeting about it. And so when I got back to work in January after the holidays, I'd try to sneak away a bit from meetings and find out what was going on and ask people questions. But I was immediately stumbling from the simple fact that I didn't speak Arabic. Spoke just enough French to maybe figure out a few tweets, but Arabic was going to be a big block for me. So I started randomly reaching out to some of the activists to see if they could help me. In this particular case, I sent out a tweet to an activist named Nasser Wadadi, and I asked him if he could help translate the text on this photo, which I had seen circulating all over the place that particular day. I could tell, looking closely at the photo, that that wasn't blood. Someone had taken red ink and spilled it to represent blood, but I still didn't know what it said. And before Nasser Wadadi was able to get back to me, another Tunisian wrote, and he told me it was actually the name of a young man, Mbarke, and he had died the day before, protesting, I believe, in the city of Kasserine. And so people were identifying the martyrs and trying to spread their names virally, just like they were spreading everything else. And so day after day, I just couldn't pull myself away from what I was seeing. I begged my colleagues at NPR to start paying attention, and the foreign desk was skeptical at first, but they said if it gets bigger, maybe we'll send someone from Paris there. But others started paying attention and said, just keep us informed if you see something happening. And what I saw was incredible, because people were doing things like this. People were using Twitter to spot snipers. They would have volunteers go out in the streets of towns like Gafsa and try to identify where snipers' nests were on top of buildings, and then they would share that through Twitter, they'd share it through Facebook, they'd share it through any means necessary. So the protest march that was planned that day, rather going down that street, went this way instead. And so in real time, these young people were using social media to save their own lives.
Who were the snipers?
The government. The government, the Interior Ministry mostly, and the police. And all of this finally reached a head on the 14th of January, when word came out that the president of Tunisia, President Ben Ali, who had been running the country for decades without any question, had gotten onto a plane with his wife, supposedly with a bunch of gold, and was flying in circles around the Mediterranean, finding a place that would let him land. And everyone in Tunisia just ran out into the streets and began celebrating. It was the first successful popular revolution in the modern Arab world. No one had ever seen anything like it. And the whole thing played out through social media. And I just kind of sat back in amazement watching these young people celebrating. And then a tweet caught my eye. Mohammed Marwan Meda, who actually lives in Ontario now, I believe. He was one of the bloggers I met in Tunisia a few years before, one of the ones that had to meet with me very secretly so he wouldn't get arrested. And here he was celebrating with everyone else, and he sent out a tweet. Okay, Arabs, you've seen how it's done in Tunisia. Tag, you're it. When I saw that, I went to my calendar at work, my Outlook calendar, and I looked at the next month, and I started putting in fake meetings every single day, blocking out 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours, whatever I could, because I knew I needed to be tweeting rather than doing whatever it was my job was supposed to be at that point in time. And that's what I ended up doing. It didn't take long for it to continue, because within a matter of days, Egyptian protesters started organizing and saying that we should all get together on National Police Day, January 25th, and protest the regime. Well, they did, and they were quickly cast about by the police, but they kept coming. On the 28th, in what they called the Day of Rage, they organized a much bigger protest, and a number of them were shot and killed by the police and in the Interior Ministry. And so, quite out of nowhere, it seemed Egypt might be the next. Whether it was going to succeed or fail, who knew, but something huge was happening here. And I had the problem that I only knew one person in Egypt. And he wasn't even there at the time. His name was Ali Abdel Fattah. And he was a community organizer and protester who I had never met in person, but we had many friends in common, and I had remembered several years before when he was arrested while trying to protest for an independent judiciary, seeing interviews with him after he was released. So he was a real guy. Seemed like he'd be a good place to start, though he was living in exile at the time in South Africa. So not knowing exactly where else to start, I went to take a look at the people he followed on Twitter. And I just skimmed all the way down to the bottom, because when you see the list of followers someone has, the newest ones are always at the top, which means the oldest ones are going to be at the bottom. And he had been on Twitter long enough that when he joined, he wasn't being forced by Twitter to follow Taylor Swift or celebrities or whatever they might be. You could just follow your friends. And so I looked at the list, starting with the first, four names here. Ultimately, I think I took the first 10 or 15 of them, and I decided to follow those people. And I started creating my own list of these people because I figured he's known them the longest on Twitter. And then I started paying attention to see how they were interacting with each other. And then I added more people. And within a few days, I had around 60 people I was following that I'd concluded were actively involved in these protests in one way or another. I was particularly struck at one point seeing tweets from one of the people on that short list, a young woman named Manal. And I saw her tweet at one point mentioning that her mother-in-law was on Al Jazeera English doing an audio call of some sort. And I tucked that way in the back of my mind, knowing that mother-in-law, well, people here are, lots of people are related to each other in these protest groups, so maybe that would help me. And as it would happen, a few days later, I saw a tweet from Ali Abdel Fattah himself saying, oh no, my mom, Dr. Layla Suwaif, has been arrested. Layla Suwaif, mom-in-law, Layla Suwaif, mom. Manal and Allah are married. And it suddenly began to make sense that all of these people who were the first to go out and really try to get things going were people who were so close to each other that they could trust each other to do such things. And over the course of the next few weeks, I discovered that so many of the people that I was following on Twitter were brothers and sisters, husbands and wives, mothers and daughters, cousins, lots of cousins. They were all connected in different ways. And in fact, when a researcher not long after the Egyptian Revolution did some analysis of of these people tweeting each other, he made a map. And what you see here is the people in blue were tweeting in English, the people in red were tweeting in Arabic, and the purple ones were tweeting a bit of both. The larger the circle, the more prolific and the more popular they were. What was really strange is I had a moment of deja vu when I saw this, because this was a fancy schmancy version of the list that I had created just by looking at other people and seeing who they were tweeting and who they were talking to each other. I didn't have the technical knowledge to make something this myself, but just following basic journalistic instincts of how people connect with each other, I was able to create a source network that ultimately represented the core of the protest movement. This was key at the height of the protests during an incident that was called the Battle of the Camel. I don't know how many of you remember this. This was an incident where protesters were based on Tahrir Square, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a bunch of thugs started getting off of buses, shipped in from nowhere, and then these guys arrived on camelback and on horses with whips and clubs and started hitting the protesters. And here's this amazing photo by Chris Hondros, an incredible photographer who unfortunately passed away a few months later in Libya while on assignment. He managed to capture this incredible moment as someone on camelback was attacking the protesters. And so for the next 14 or 15 hours, I tweeted over 1,000 times. So just take that in for a second. I tweeted over 1,000 times. No rational person would do something like this. It makes no sense. Most people who use Twitter might post a dozen things a day and move on. But what I was seeing is all of these contacts of mine that I had assembled on Twitter in the previous days were now under attack and were live tweeting their experiences. Some of them were live streaming from balconies or from cameras they had set up in the square. And so I basically turned my desktop into a war room to monitor this all. And as I retweeted what people were sharing, I also started doing live color commentary as people got involved in stone throwing fights and Molotov cocktail fights. It went on for hours and hours. It lasted so long that Twitter actually shut me down because they thought I was spam. When I hit 1,000 tweets, it stopped. But thankfully, I knew someone at Twitter, and they turned me back on, so I was able to do another 400 or so by the time it was 1 or 2 in the morning, my time. And so for that 14, 15, 16 period of hours, I did nothing but offer live rolling coverage on Twitter of the Battle of the Camel. And just watching one tweet after another, after another, after another, after another, after another, after another, I realized I wasn't just watching people who were sharing information with each other. Instead, I realized I was gaining a form of situational awareness, almost like I was in a helicopter. There were times I could even picture myself in a helicopter above Tahrir Square, pulling up Google Maps to see where people might be located, triangulating their locations based on their descriptions, putting dots on that map when people would say where they were to see if they were going to be able to get out safely. And trying to narrate all of this in real time, I was able to describe what was happening on the ground in a way that a journalist who might have been there in one corner of Tahrir Square, well, what they would have captured would have been extraordinarily powerful and visceral. It didn't necessarily have the big picture from above. And using social media, I was able to do that. But this was just the beginning of what would turn out to be a very long period of time, because January 25, the hashtag, became the RSVP for Egypt. But then, Feb 14 came up for Bahrain, Feb 17 for Libya, Feb 19 for Algeria, Feb 20, Morocco. On and on and on it went. It was around this time that my boss noticed that I hadn't been coming to meetings. And so he came up to me and leaned over my desk, and I was in the cubicle, so this is probably about the right angle. And he stared at me for a moment with a bit of a smirk on his face, and I'm bracing myself. And he sighed and then said, "I don't understand what you're doing, but please keep doing it." And with that, he cleared my plate for the next 2 years. He transferred all of my job duties to other people. He informed the foreign desk what I was up to, and basically said, whatever you think is appropriate with these tools, just have at it, and just keep doing it until you think the story has run its course. And so, for For the next 2 years, I had an extraordinary opportunity of bearing witness to the Arab Spring, despite the fact that I was 5,000, 6,000 miles away in Washington, D.C. One of the next things I got to see happen was in Libya. Libyan protests, they were so excited to start on February 17th, they actually got started on the 16th. They couldn't wait. So they scooped themselves and started protesting. And at first Gaddafi tried saying, well, I'm the ultimate revolutionary. I always have been, so I'm the leader of your revolution. They didn't care for that. And within a few days, he started bringing out his artillery and anti-aircraft guns and started shooting into crowds. And as the days turned into weeks, the protesters turned into a group of rabble-rousers with rudimentary weapons, forming into rebel groups that managed to surge forward for a while until it got to the point where they were pushed back and it appeared they were all going to fall and collapse on the city of Benghazi, March 19th, 2011. And this was when the UN and NATO finally decided to move forward, and the first Italian planes came in to start bombing to prevent forces from Gaddafi's regime moving into Libya. So what had started as a protest and then became a revolution and then a rout was now turning into a civil war. And there was a lot to keep up on, a lot. And I had to interact with my followers as much as possible, especially because the people in Libya speak a particular dialect of Arabic that not everyone else in the Arab world can understand. So I had to have friends ask friends of their friends and other friends until I could find people who either were from Libya or had spent time there who could volunteer and help me sort these things out. And they were very gracious and very generous in their time. Sometimes they even sent me tips. In one case, one day, I got an email from someone and they asked me about a mortar, a photo of a mortar, and they wanted to know if I had any information on the manufacturer. And they sent it to me, and I looked at the photo, and this is what they showed me. And I looked at that, and I said, okay, there's a star and a crescent and some words and some guys. I don't know what's going on here. And so I asked him, why are you sharing this with me? And he said, oh, I just wanted to let you know because Al Jazeera just reported that the Israelis are secretly supplying Gaddafi with weapons. And some are claiming they're chemical weapons. Okay. So knowing that people were going to get riled up immediately over this one somewhat ridiculous claim, I jumped in and said, all right, guys, for argument's sake, let's say Israel sold mortars to Libya. Would they be so dumb as to put a Star of David on it? Probably not. So once again, I asked my followers for help, and this time I asked them to search databases and the websites of arms manufacturers and arms expos and anything else they could find. And within 15 or 20 minutes, I started getting photos like this. Excuse me, this came from a photo. Excuse me, this is a photo of a shell that's on display at an arms fair in India. Not exactly the same symbol, but there's a six-pointed star and then there's some kind of crescent above it. And people kept digging, and soon they actually found schematics with a six-pointed star on it going all the way back to 1914, all the way back to the beginning of World War I. It turns out that for the last almost 100 years at that point, the symbol of the six-pointed star was used for what are known as illumination rounds or star shells. And for those that come down on parachutes, they will often add a little parachute on top of it. Suddenly, that doesn't look like a Star of David with a crescent on it anymore. That's just the military symbol. And thanks to my followers, they quickly found a recently declassified NATO manual from just a few years before that, showing that if you were going to have illumination rounds of any type, that you had to classify it with a six-pointed star. And so not only did I share this with all of my followers, to their credit, many of the Arab tweeps who were following me at the time shared it with their own. Said, guys, false alarm, Israel has nothing to do with this. It didn't stop Press TV from running a story a few days later claiming the exact same thing. So in some ways it was a taste of things to come, that even when you could prove that something wasn't true, If a news organization wanted to report it, or if trolls wanted to report it, it was going to happen. But that's a talk for another day. Meanwhile, in Syria, protesters began organizing around March 15th of that year. And for the first few months, it was an extraordinary act of courage and civic bravery by members of the public going out and marching without weapons, demanding freedom and demanding that President Assad step down. And as we all know, it didn't last. Over time, later that summer and into the fall, certain members of Assad's military regime defected to the protesters, and they brought their weapons with them. And they became the Free Syrian Army. And so what had started as a peaceful protest movement now had an army to back it up, whether they wanted one or not. And we all know what's happened in the 7 years since. At least 500,000 people dead. At this point, the protesters and the revolutionaries essentially routed with Assad controlling the majority of the country with his help from his friends at Hezbollah and from Russia. But before all of that happened, the media was transfixed by these protesters, and they wanted to be able to tell stories that would resonate with the public. That's where A Gay Girl in Damascus comes in. So I had heard of this blog, didn't know much about it, but it turned out, according to this reporter from The Guardian who was in Damascus, there was this Syrian-American woman named Amina Araf. And she had, after graduating from college in Atlanta, I think, she had moved back to Syria the year before and had started blogging about her experience. And she was a bit political to begin with, but not extremely so. But as soon as the revolution happened, she just launched. And she became a media darling. After they interviewed her for The Guardian, CNN and all these other news organizations would text message her for interviews and Skype message her for interviews, whatever they could get. And she was probably the most well-known of the protesters in Syria at the time, and honestly only because her blog was named Gay Girl in Damascus. The media couldn't resist that. So that June, we got the news that she had been kidnapped. And one of her cousins had posted a small blog entry on her site saying that Amina had gone out one day, had been grabbed by the Mukhabarat, the secret police, and hadn't been seen of since. And so immediately social media mobilized. People started creating graphics like this and sharing them on Facebook pages and encouraging people to change their Twitter avatars and posting on Reddit and elsewhere. People organized protests in front of Syrian embassies around the world. The State Department even got involved. And so, like I said, I didn't really know much about her, but I figured now that she's been kidnapped, I better figure it out quickly. So I started talking to all my sources that I knew in Damascus and started hearing things like, oh, well, yeah, she comes to meetings of the local coordination committee all the time, though I don't think we've met in person. Or, oh, yeah, she's active in the LGBT community, but I don't go to those meetings anymore. And this happened for a while, and so somewhat uncomfortably, I started asking what people really knew through private messages. And a contact of mine in Damascus, a young man who went by the name of Danny Seizit, who is currently enrolled in the graduate school here at UBC taking creative writing, and will become a Canadian citizen next month. At that point in time, he was still in hiding in Damascus, and he was very active in the local LGBT community. And he messaged me and said that he'd been asking everyone he knew in the community. And not only did no one know her, no one had even heard of her. And so I started asking, again, cautiously and a bit trepidatiously, publicly, has anyone met Amina in person? If so, please contact me. Or let me ask a question another way. Does anyone know anyone else who's met Gay Girl in Damascus in person? Now, my intention was to keep this among friends. My Twitter account wasn't huge at this point. It had maybe 25,000 followers, which was decent, but not huge. And I figured, well, at least we could maybe have a quick conversation about who would actually know her. The next morning, I woke up and saw this story in the New York Times, quoting me, about me raising concerns about the existence of Amina Araf. Suddenly Twitter explodes, and I started getting all of this hate mail from the activist community saying that I was completely undermining poor Amina Araf, that she had been in hiding, she had been protecting herself, she probably would even disguise herself at times in order to do all of this safely, and you're not giving her credit. So I just kept asking people, show me someone who has met her in person. And no one could do it. And it didn't take long for the Wall Street Journal to look into this photo that had been circulating of Amina Araf and discovering that it was actually a photo of a woman named Jelena Lecic, who was a Croatian woman living in London, I believe, and had never heard of Amina Araf. And now, just to put this in context, the woman known as Amina Araf had been using this picture on her Facebook page for over a year. So this wasn't necessarily a stunt or anything related to the Arab Spring. This was her identity for at least the last year. So a bunch of us started finding volunteers who could look at databases of housing records and criminal records and looking at IP addresses for when she had posted to other sites. And all of it suddenly came together in a matter of 3 or 4 days to the point where a group of us were able to announce with confidence that Amina Araf was actually Tom McMasters. May I introduce you to Tom McMasters, graduate PhD student in Byzantine history, studying at the University of Edinburgh. According to Tom, when he finally acknowledged that he had done it, said that he had created the persona so he could engage in authentic conversations about the Middle East and avoid issues of the current Orientalism that exists in modern media. That wasn't taken as an apology. People were really, really upset. And it raised a lot of questions of what's it going to mean for the next Syrian protester who gets arrested and disappears. A few weeks later, a Syrian woman named Razan, who I'd known for several months at that point on Twitter, she was arrested. No one's heard from her since. Still gone. It's been 7 years now. She exists. I know people who've known her in person. But because her arrest happened soon after this incident, lots of people ask questions. How are we sure we're not being duped yet again?
But you don't think she's alive?
We'll save that conversation for later. But while all this was going on, I found myself in a very strange place because for the first time in my life, I was an internet celebrity. Within the next 24 hours, a Taiwanese breaking news service created an animation of me looking a bit, I was about right size heaviness perhaps, but a lot balder than I actually was, or a lot more balding, with Twitter birds floating around me, sending me messages. And if you actually go and watch the video, you see me run up to a woman typing at a computer, and I grab a wig off her head, and it's Tom McMaster, and he runs away. Later that evening, Jon Stewart aired it on The Daily Show. So here I went from being just another guy at NPR covering interesting stories on social media to getting profiled in everywhere from technology news organizations to mainstream news organizations. And week after week, day after day, I was getting invites to talk to people. I mean, John Gomeshi at one point, it's, for better or worse, everyone wanted to talk to me. And people started asking this question, is this the world's best Twitter account? And so for the next 2 years, with all of this floating in the back of my head, I spent around 15 to 16 hours a day tweeting 7 days a week. I would get up at 5 or 6. While making breakfast, I would go online to see what I had missed overnight. I'd help get my kids ready for school and send them off. I'd go to work and tweet until 6 p.m. I'd come home, tweet during the commute, make dinner, put the kids to bed, hang out with my wife for maybe an hour, and then go back on Twitter for another 3 or 4 hours until midnight, and start the process again, 7 days a week, for 2 years. And all of this seemed absolutely normal to me. And then at some point in maybe 2014, 2015, I saw this. I was walking down the street around the corner from NPR. I'd just gone to a local salad bar to get some lunch. And I stepped outside, and on the street, I saw several pieces of cauliflower that had been run over by a car. I fell to the ground and had a panic attack. I had never had one before, and I thought I was having a heart attack. It passed fast enough that no one called an ambulance or anything. But I wearily got up, wondered what the hell that was all about, and went back to work. But it wasn't just cauliflower. I started noticing that certain times I would see food and begin to have panic attacks or begin to feel them coming on. When I'd see someone with a melon, or pictures of someone, God forbid, with a melon baller, I'd panic. Every night when I made pasta for my kids and we didn't have spaghetti and I was forced to make penne, my skin would begin to crawl, and I didn't understand why. When I'd go to bed each night, I'd have dreams about my son playing in his room and explosions happening and everything coming down on top of him and crushing him. And it took another year or so before I was finally diagnosed with PTSD. I had never heard of PTSD among journalists who had never actually really gone anywhere. It's something that happens to combat reporters, certainly. It occasionally happens to photo editors who spend their entire days going through crime scene footage and the like, but I'm just a social media guy who's tweeting a lot. Not only was it ridiculous that I could have PTSD, it was embarrassing. I felt, knowing it made me even more guilty, knowing all the people out there who are on the streets protesting and all the reporters who had gone out there risking their lives and losing their lives sometimes, that here I am complaining, having panic attacks because I was on Twitter. But I began to understand how complex this issue was. Eventually I read the book by David J. Morris, The Evil Hours. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's one of the most beautiful books I've ever read about combat, and it is also a biography of the history of PTSD and the stress and trauma experienced by soldiers, rape victims, and others. And this one quote really got to me. "Trauma destroys the fabric of time. In normal time, you move from one moment to the next, sunrise to sunset, birth to death. After trauma, you may move in circles, finding yourself being sucked backwards into an eddy or bouncing like a rubber ball from now to then to back again. In the traumatic universe, the basic laws of matter are suspended. Ceiling fans can be helicopters. Car exhaust can be mustard gas. Cauliflowers can be brains." And so here I am. I've talked a bit about all the things that I've done during the Arab Spring. A lot of it was fun. It was exciting. I mean, gay girl in Damascus. How do you top gay girl in Damascus? These are all the safe stories to tell, the fun examples that I could tell. Not the times when I saw my sources dying when they were live streaming. Not the time when I stumbled upon a video of a colleague being beheaded by ISIS. Not the times I tried to verify the body parts in Libya and whether they constituted one or two or three people. Those stories aren't fun. They're horrible. Yet they're some of the most important stories that need to be told about the Arab Spring, and yet I feel paralyzed telling them to you because I honestly don't know how I could get through it. And like I said, most of our recent history regarding PTSD has regarded the understanding of soldiers coming back. Thankfully, it's extended to survivors of rape, sexual assault. But in recent years, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been an increase in research and understanding and empathy regarding journalists who don't go out to the field but yet experience it. A couple years ago, there was a report put together by a group called Eyewitness Media, and they anonymously interviewed social media editors, reporters, producers, and I was shocked at how many of them had the same stories I had to share. Different triggers, different times, different places, but suffering all the same. And as they they concluded in their study after they did this broad survey of social media editors, they found that over 37% of them were having stress adversely impacting their lives. I say that very carefully. They didn't necessarily have PTSD because that is a clinical diagnosis, but they had individually self-reported stress that was adversely affecting their professional lives and their personal lives. So a couple of years ago, I decided to create a Facebook group called Journalism in Trauma. And since then, over 1,000 journalists have joined, and they use this space to share their stories of the hells they've gone through, whether it's been in person or online, as well as therapists and psychiatrists and others who are now beginning to specialize in issues of secondary trauma and vicarious trauma when it comes to the news profession. And it's slow, and it's hard to convince editors and managers to take this seriously, but at least we're heading in the direction. Having said that, I still worry, because if you look at the body of research that's out there, going all the way back to 9/11, people have studied the ways secondary trauma have impacted not just journalists, but the public at large. More recently, a study was done of people who consumed footage or observed the Boston Marathon bombings and all the coverage that happened after it, and they were able to correlate a connection between the daily hours of coverage and the stress level that they were experiencing based on clinical stress tests that were applied to them. Around the same time, a British professor gave a talk at the conference of the British Psychology Society, expressing her concerns that the increased access to social media and digital media in general, and smartphones, with that it's going to raise the risks, and we need to find ways to offer appropriate support. I don't see any of that happening. In fact, I see the opposite. I see people online trying to organize themselves as best as possible, using social media in ways that they could never tell their stories before. But their stories are terrifying. I see videos of Philando Castile being shot and filmed by his girlfriend being posted online so the world pays attention to African Americans being killed by police. I see David Hogg and his fellow students at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School posting video from in the school while they're on lockdown, trying to figure out how the hell they were going to get out alive. I see the Kavanaugh hearings with Dr. Blasey Ford testifying, knowing that this was not only a social media moment, but a broadcast moment, that the entire U.S. had stopped doing everything, and everyone was going to stop and start recounting their own experiences with sexual trauma. I knew this past week that my Facebook feed would be inundated by grieving and angry friends. Nasser Wadadi, the man who helped me on Twitter in Tunisia, that's him on the left. This is a picture from this past March in Oslo where I bumped into a group of them at a conference. The man in the baseball cap is Jamal Khashoggi. He's a journalist in Saudi Arabia. Last week he disappeared, and the Turkish government believes he was killed, dismembered, and his body disposed of in the consulate of Saudi Arabia in Turkey. How on earth can I even go online every day knowing that on any given day something like this is going to pop up, whether it's happening to someone I know or someone I don't know? How can I be expected to get up in the morning and do my job, or let alone expect anyone to be doing their civic duty and participating in civil society? Some days I'm really down, and I am not able to answer this question. But then on other days, I'm able to remember that it's by embracing and encouraging social media at its best, when it's helping people organize for positive change, just as I saw so many times in its early days. Seeing people here who come together at the Women's March in D.C., all responding to a Facebook event RSVP at the time of the election. Or David Hogg and his fellow students at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. They have 500,000, 1 million, 1.5 million followers on Twitter. People are walking out of schools to protest with them. They have become a movement into itself, more powerful than anything in the US since Black Lives Matter. If you go on places like Snapchat and Twitter, you can actually visualize students walking out, school after school, state after state, using social media to document how they are standing up. I see it in my own kids who are so inspired by their classmates and their peers that they absolutely demand that they get to go to a protest. And so my wife and I take them to the White House so they could stand up for Muslim children and children from Mexico, just so they could say, we care, and give the children back. I realize the only way that I can get through this at any time is by embracing the solidarity. Now, I know I'm a journalist, and I have to maintain a certain amount of distance. But in the world today with social media, distance is impossible. There is no way to avoid getting to know the people you are covering, whether they are people you respect or don't respect, whether they are doing good things or bad things, whether they are soldiers on one side or other, or they are people caught in the middle. It's bearing witness to this solidarity taking place in so many forms that is what allows me to move forward. Because if we can't remain hopeful about social media's power to mobilize the public, then what's the point of even using it anymore? Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.